Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always, you can listen to this and previous episodes of the show on our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. You can also check us out on Twitter at irishhistorypod or Facebook. If you get a chance, please like and review the show, rate and review the show on iTunes. It really helps us to promote the show. On today's episode, myself and John Dorney are going to be discussing the Dáil Courts. Now, John, what were the Dáil Courts?
Well, the Dáil Courts have gone down in history as like an alternative revolutionary court system to replace the British court system. But if you actually look at what happened, the Dáil Courts were kind of an improvisation. You know, they kind of happened from activists on the ground rather than having there being a central plan. So one thing when looking into this I found is that kind of the ancestor of the Dáil Courts is the arbitration courts of the Land League back in the days of the Land War, which would set rents on disputed estates. Those didn't last. I mean, they were replaced by arbitration courts by the Gladstone government. But in 1917, 1918, there's another great resurgence of land conflict, one of the periodic ones, especially in the west of Ireland. And what you started to see was people setting up local courts outside of the British system to try to adjudicate on land disputes rather than, criminal cases at first. But there was so many, land disputes and cattle drives and things like this. But, in many places the volunteers got involved. For example, Michael Brennan in County Clare, but in County Cavan there was an early example of one of these courts. But they were legal because they were arbitration courts where the two parties would get together and they could voluntarily accept the verdict. Now, they were adopted by the Dáil. So the Dáil, the revolutionary parliament of the Republic, Irish Republic, declared independence in 1919. And one of the things they wanted to do actually was to calm the land agitation in the West, because they feared that it would undermine the nationalist agitation. They didn't want to be distracted. So one of the things they did was they adopted these arbitration courts. And in Kevin O'Shiel was first of all set up a land commission. But secondly, in May of 1920, they adopted these courts that were springing up around the country. And first, they were put under the Department of Agriculture. We'll show again the inspiration for it.
We should say as well the Department of Agriculture of the revolutionary Dáil government. That's not...
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Don't think of, yeah. So don't think of, the Department of Agriculture on Kildare Street with the big office. This is a insurrectionary government, if you like. But they adopted these courts and they put them under the Department of Agriculture in May 1920. But by June, the courts had started to handle, other business, because there's also a breakdown of law and order, due to, the police being boycotted and stuff like that. But in June, they get transferred. The authority gets transferred from the Department of Agriculture to the Department of Home Affairs. Now, this is all, of course, as you said, it's an underground government, but under Austin Stack, who's the Minister for Home Affairs. And they adopted the courts, and, at this point, they got renamed the Dáil Courts, because they were under the authority of the Dáil. And the idea now is that these are courts that are going to replace the British system, that these are Irish courts as a rival and as a replacement for the existing courts. And this is something quite different. This is challenging the King's writ, Yeah. It's an insurrectionary act, really, if you're saying, don't follow the law that's there, we'll make our own law. There's some dispute about the kind of law that they followed, but basically the instruction was that they were to implement the law as it existed on January 21st, 1919, so the day they declared independence. Now, there's some accounts will tell you they used civil law or Brehon law and stuff like this, but they didn't really. They used the existing law with maybe some minor, local modifications. But one of the interesting things, and this is probably not that well known, is that Austin Stack went around and he got sympathetic lawyers and judges, and he recruited them to man the Dáil Courts. He recruited the professor of law at UCD, so A. Cleary, as the Supreme Justice of the Republic, and Cahir Davitt, who was the son of Michael Davitt, the Land League agitator, but he was a lawyer, and Dermot Crowley, who we'll be talking a lot about, as circuit judges. And Davitt and Crowley were sent to supervise the work of the courts in different areas, and and they also wrote down the procedure and so forth for the Dáil Courts. So there's this attempt to regularise them, and there's also a portion of the volunteers of the IRA is kind of seconded, and it's called the IRP, the Irish Republican Police, and their job is to, insofar as possible, to implement the rulings of the Dáil Courts. their justice could be very rough and ready. Like, for example, there's stories of people being rowed out to islands in Lough Corrib until they accepted the verdict. I mean, in Dublin, there's 12 men in the squad of the IRP. And, what they did was they arrested criminals and they stuck them in a shed in Ringsend, pending deportation. Then they stuck them on a boat to England. So sometimes the justice could be very rough and ready. Now, one thing just before I finish this long-winded answer, Cathal, is it's a mistake, though, to confuse the Dáil Courts with the IRA's court-martials, right? So the IRA was supposed to conduct court-martials for shooting informers, on the Save GHQ. They didn't always do that, but that was the theory. But that's something quite different, right? So sometimes people confuse and they think the Dáil Courts were sentencing people to death. They weren't. That was a separate thing. That was an IRA thing. The Minister for Local Government, again in the Dáil, Cosgrave, W.T. Cosgrave, and his deputy, Kevin O'Higgins, were very keen on trying to use the IRP and the IRA to enforce the rulings of the Dáil Courts and also to collect rates and stuff for the county councils that were controlled by the Republicans. The IRA wasn't that keen on it, but that's an important distinction to make. So the Dáil Courts are the civil side of the revolution, if you like. They're activists. The judges are elected locally, so sometimes they're women. Like, for example, in Dublin, there was 2 Dáil Courts underground, illegal, in Pembroke Ward and in Rathmines Ward. I think women sat in them, but also Catholic clergy quite often sat in them. Occasionally Protestant clergy were asked to sit in them as well. But they were the civil side of the revolution, though. They were this thing of like bypassing the British system, ignoring it. Well,
it's almost a Leninist idea of like revolution, where you're setting up an alternative shadow state to replace the official state. So as you were saying there about the Department of Agriculture, when the Dáil declares independence and the Sinn Féin elected, which we've discussed in a previous podcast about the 1918 election, when the majority of Irish MPs elected in 1918 for Sinn Féin set up their own parliament in Dublin, it's not just viewed as an empty act. They're going on to set up an alternative state with all the apparatus of a state.
They really do it, yeah. This is the amazing thing, and it's also true in the sphere of local government, which I just kind of alluded to. It's the lesser known side. It's not the ambushes and the raids and so forth, but it's possibly more important in a lot of ways. One difference, obviously, with the Leninist conception is that, the Dáil Courts in general are relatively conservative, So the idea is like to calm land conflict, and the land conflict is serious enough. There's shots fired and stuff over land disputes. And there's still quite a lot of, the classic landlords, the Anglo-Irish kind of caste, are still around in quite a lot of places, contrary to what a lot of people think. But also, there's a lot of cases of big farmers, so-called ranchers, who are also probably nationalists of sorts, and people are trying to take their land and divide it up among tenant farmers, and that's Sinn Féin judge that as something that's going to divide their support base. But they're trying to calm land conflict. There's episodes of strikes which are kind of they tend to try to settle them with some sort of compromise, but there's certainly no kind of social revolutionary agenda. Definitely not. There's one case, for example, in Dublin which I came across, where Austin Stack intervened, where the Republican court had ruled that someone didn't have to pay back a moneylender who would charge like 200% interest, and Austin Stack intervened and said, well, this contravenes the right to private property, so actually they do have to pay it back. So there's no real social revolutionary agenda, but it is certainly nationalist revolutionary agenda in terms of replacing the British system.
Yes, well, that's what we should say as well, that this must have been subject to suppression by the British, and holding courts in an area could be liable, those involved, to arrest.
Well, that's quite so, and that's an interesting point, because the British authorities, and especially the British military, interestingly, they were happy enough with the courts, and they were in the stage of being arbitration courts, because they said they were helping to keep order. Once the courts made a claim to like rival sovereignty, I suppose, rival authority, then they immediately urged them to be clamped down on, and they were. So in the summer of July, so about the summer of 1920, about July 1920, so around a month after Stack had set up the courts as courts, they start to be suppressed. So they're raided by the police, the RSC, and they're raided by the army, the British Army, and their activists are arrested. For example, in Donegal, I have a report of the clerk, I think, of the Dáil Court, who was arrested with 48 summons, summoning people to court, so claiming the authority of the law. And he's given hard labour, sent off to Ballycunler. But the most high profile was Dermot Crowley. As I mentioned, Dermot Crowley was a lawyer, Trinity educated. He had been in the British civil service but had resigned. And he was one of the circuit judges Now, he was a man open to extravagant gestures, as we'll see, but he openly held a court in Ballina, in spite of the fact that there had been a decree forbidding the court to meet. But he openly held it, probably not in the courthouse, but in a public building in Ballina, County Mayo. And he was arrested and he was given 2 years hard labour. So, there was serious penalties, and by the autumn of 1920, the courts had been more or less driven underground. There was one or two operating, but basically they'd been suppressed by that point.
Well, I think it's interesting looking back at newspapers from the late 19th, early 20th centuries, that Ireland comes across as a very litigious society. That the reports that come from, the petty sessions and the quarterly assizes, report after report after report of neighbours taking action against neighbours for various things to do with property, things involving money, owing money or anything like that. So if you had a situation in Ireland where, as the War of Independence ramps up and courts cannot meet, there had to be something there to replace it.
Well, it's a funny thing. I mean, you're quite right. And I mean, when you look at the local papers at the time, that's exactly what you see, and an incredible detail of coverage. And most of the cases that went before the Dáil Courts were ordinary cases. They were like that. There were disputes over things, or they were for petty theft, or the usual stuff. And they made an effort to try to get lawyers and so on to use them. But I mean, there's but to answer your question, there's cases like in the petty sessions, which was the previous system, the existing system, where judges say, I turned up to host the sessions, for example, in Kerry, the example I'm talking about, and there was nobody turned up. So once the Dáil Courts were suppressed, while the courts were operating in some places, they weren't properly operating. They were being boycotted in a lot of cases. And the police had become very militarised as well. They weren't really investigating crime. There was a lot of vigilante justice, and not just by the IRA, but also by local vigilantes, because law and order broke down really in a lot of Ireland. It didn't completely break down everywhere, but for practical purposes, it kind of did. Now, when the truce came around, one of the things Aston Stack really tried to do was to get the Dáil Courts back up and running. As a historian of the Dáil Courts has written, that the courts took on a tremendous amount of new business during the truce period. So this is the period after July 1921 until the signing of the treaty in December 1921. So
there was no threat of suppression by the British state?
Well, that's a good question. There was. That's the amazing thing. So there was this is the point when there's the war is off, cancelled. There's two rival court systems operating, right? And the RAC and the IRP are actually competing on the ground for who can suppress crime more, and neither of them did a very good job by all accounts. But it's very interesting that the Dáil Courts were still being raided. And I mean, for example, in Donegal, because I happen to be looking at Donegal for an example, but in Donegal, they raided a Dáil Court in late 1921, just before the treaty was signed. The police did. And the argument of the Dáil Court was, well, this is just an arbitration court.
But wouldn't that be viewed as quite provocative and maybe a threat to the truce?
Yeah, well, the truce was a very rocky thing. I mean, it was almost observed more in the breach than the observance in a lot of cases. But this thing of the competition between who's going to impose the law was a real thing. I mean, I've come across cases in Cavan Monaghan area where the IRA would arrest people for crimes for theft, usually stealing cattle and stuff, and then the RAC would arrest the IRA men who arrested them and let the thieves go. And then and then there's other cases where they both arrive at the same time to arrest the same people. It was and they're both armed. So yeah, it was a very unstable situation. And what brought it to a head was, of course, the treaty. And under the treaty, the RAC was disbanded. And it wasn't. That's not actually a term of the treaty, but that was agreed. While there was nothing explicitly in the court system about the treaty, what you're left with is the British civil and military states being evacuated out of Ireland. And you still have two rival court systems. So in the first 6 months of 1922, the nationalist movement, the Republican movement, split over the treaty, over the terms, obviously. This ends up being civil war between pro and anti-treaty elements. But another aspect of it is, and just yet a little digression, another aspect of it is there's technically two rival assemblies. So under the treaty, there's the Parliament of Southern Ireland. But the Parliament that Republicans think they're attending is the Dáil, the second Dáil. So I mean, there's this very confused idea of what the power is and what the legitimate power is in this period, almost a period of dual power, to use a Leninist phrase. But there's also two rival court systems. So the government declares its preference in early 1922 to get the previous system, the petty sessions and the circuit courts and so on, back up and running. And they convened a constitutional committee chaired by Lord Glenavy, who had been a prominent unionist, but he was supportive of the treaty, to set up a new High Court, right? But at the same time, the Dáil Courts are doing most of the business, actually, in many areas. So
was this an issue that had been thought about or covered at all in the treaty or during the treaty negotiations?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, when you look at the actual terms of the treaty, I mean, there's actually very little in it about the nitty-gritty of Irish life or Irish legal or political systems. I mean, this must have been agreed separately in the actual terms of the treaty. There was long negotiations about the constitution and what that would involve in early 22, and I assume that was covered there. But even things like, for example, release of prisoners isn't a term of the treaty at all. When we talk about the treaty negotiations, there's probably more than one thing going on, and to talk about them just as the treaty negotiations is probably too limited.
Well, I wonder for people who are involved, pro-treatyites within Sinn Féin, that and maybe outside Sinn Féin as well, when they're looking at the Dáil Courts, perhaps they imagine that under the new Free State that the new legal system would adopt some of the more egalitarian aspects of the Dáil Courts. I was like, you're dealing with a situation previous to that in Ireland under the UK where barristers wore robes and wigs, judges were still in all their gowns and regalia.
Yeah.
And under the Dáil Courts, there's none of this. Yeah, as you mentioned there earlier, women are acting as judges. So what happens there?
Judges are elected, actually. Yeah, well, that's the thing. And I mean, there may have been a debate about this, but really what brought it to a head and what finished it was the Civil War. Because they allowed the situation to drift. Like a lot of things were allowed to drift in early 1922. But it drifted until July 1922, when the Civil War broke out in June 28th, 1922, when the pro-treaty army, the National Army, attacked the Four Courts and the anti-treaty IRA there. The fighting broke out around the country, but lots of people were taken prisoner in the fighting in Dublin. I think about 700, if I recall. And one of them, George Plunkett, appealed to Dermot Crowley, who, as I've mentioned, was one of the senior judges of the Dáil Courts, and who had been released after the treaty. He was imprisoned for participation in the Dáil Courts. Interesting, just a quick aside, I mean, one of the ministers of the Free State, Patrick Hogan, was also imprisoned for his role in the Dáil Courts. But anyway, George Plunkett appealed to the Dáil Courts under a writ of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is the right not to be imprisoned without trial, right, for the release of his son, who had been captured in the Four Courts. And Dermot Crowley issued a decree in his capacity as a Supreme Justice of the Dáil Courts that he must be released because he hadn't been charged with anything, and there was no legislation authorising it. And that is quite correct, because there was no legislation until September, it was drafted in September and passed in November 1922. So the people were illegally held. He issued a writ to the Minister for Defence, Richard Mulcahy, saying that the prisoners, that they had to show cause of arrest or release the prisoners by the 26th of July. He issued a writ to Richard Mulcahy and also to the Governor of Mountjoy Prison. And in response to this, on July 25th, which was the day before Crowley's deadline, the Provisional Government abolished the Dáil Courts by decree. So they rescinded the law passed in June 1920 by the first Dáil, but they just abolished the Dáil Court system, overnight. And interestingly, George Gavin Duffy resigned in protest from the Provisional Government at the abolition of the Dáil Courts. But for Dermot Crowley, on the July 26th, when his deadline was up and when the Dáil Courts had just been abolished, he issued another decree calling the dissolution illegal and ordering the arrest of Richard Mulcahy and Colm O'Murcha, who was the governor of Mountjoy Prison. So I told you, Crowley was prone to grand gestures. Yeah. So
seems like an unwise grand gesture.
It was an extremely unwise thing, right? So this is he also, and incidentally, he also issued a decree to Owen McNeill. What's the word? Ordering him to convene the Dáil, because of course the Dáil wasn't convened. The Dáil elected in June 22 wasn't convened until well into the Civil War, until after Michael Cullen's death. In fact, that's another story. But anyway, Dermot Crowley, he didn't get away with this grand gesture, of course, because he was picked up on the street by members of the CID, which was, the strong arm of the Free State, as he was walking down the street, and he was stuck into Wellington Barracks, which was at the time a notorious holding centre for prisoners. And there's a long correspondence between him and Cahir Davitt. Now, Cahir Davitt was he went on to be Chief Justice of the Free State. At the time, he was, if I recall correctly, his exact position as legal advisor to the army at this particular time. But he's pro-treaty, that's my point. But Cahir Davitt had helped Dermot Crowley set up the Dáil Court system in the first place. Now, there's long correspondence between Cahir David and Dermot Crowley when he's in prison, or when he's in the barracks. He's held prisoner anyway. And it's published in, David published it in his Bureau of Military History statement. And the conditions were very bad, and he was in a cell with 3 or 4 prisoners. But because he was a special case, he was not beaten. So the other prisoners would be taken out at night and beaten up. And Dermot managed to avoid that.
But just out of interest, do you know if Crowley had expressed an opinion pro or anti the treaty?
I'm not sure about that because, he certainly he was very anti-treaty right afterwards. But, he was acting in his position. His position was that he was acting in his position as Supreme Justice of the Dáil Courts, and what the government was doing was illegal. He wanted them to follow the law as he understood it. So I'm not sure about that, if he had expressed a public position about the treaty. I mean, certainly afterwards he was very hardcore anti-treaty, but that's perhaps to be expected.
Yes.
But he was held in Wellington Barracks until, I think, he was arrested in late July or early August, and he was held probably for about a month or two. I mean, there's one account that he was arrested. He was held there for a few weeks, but I think there's other accounts that he was held there till October 22. And Cahir David basically managed to get him out. And at least he wasn't beaten up like the other prisoners who were there. But it's, it does raise a very interesting question about, the legality of everything that was going on at the time. But then the wider question of the Dáil Courts is, like a lot of things, the provisional government, they took a very kind of moralistic line, and so Kevin O'Higgins would get up in the Dáil and there was a Dáil Courts winding up bill. And he said all the Dáil Courts were corrupt and nobody was getting good justice from them and so on, and they were, covered for land grabbers and so on. Now, none of which was true, because they were actually quite conservative in their rulings, and they did have, because of Crowley and Davitt and also James Creed Meredith, who we'll speak a bit about in a second, they did have a written code of conduct. But anyway, it's, the government's version was that they were corrupt and stuff like that, and that's why they were abolished.
This must have led to enormous resentment from people who put a lot of effort into the Dáil Courts.
Well, indeed, and not only that, but can you imagine you mentioned that it's a very litigious society, right? There's 5,000 cases backed up in the Dáil Courts because they mostly outside of Dublin and maybe the cities, people have been using the Dáil Courts rather than the other courts, let's say the British courts, but the existing courts. So what they found was, when they investigated it, there was 5,000 cases, including appeals, that were backed up. So at the end of the Civil War, they had to set up a new body, which they called the Dáil Courts Winding Up Commission. It was based in Dublin Castle. And interestingly, Crowley was forgiven his misdemeanours because he was offered a position in it, but he turned him down. Now, one possible reason is he turned him down is because he didn't get the chief position. But another reason is because he declared himself a staunch anti-treaty by this point. The main legal player here is James Creed Meredith, who was another one of these lawyers who would help to set up the Dáil Courts in the first place. Him and several others had to they had to travel the country and they had to sort out these 5,000 cases, and their work went on until 1924. It's a very interesting story, actually. You could almost write a book about just the Dáil Courts Winding Up Commission. And apparently, I haven't read their records, but their records are held in the National Archives of Ireland. And of course, the Free State went on to it went on to set up its system of justice, its high courts and so on, and under its new constitution. Yeah.
But very much replicating the old system rather than, even just in appearance and style, the Dáil Courts.
100%, yeah. There's nothing much Republican about their imagery or anything like that, yeah.
So as he discussed there with Crowley,
yeah,
obviously this makes him persona non grata when coming to nail her in government. So what happens when Fianna Fáil?
Well, you'd think that, wouldn't you? But actually they seem to have forgiven Crowley for whatever reason, possibly because he had a lot of influential friends like Cahir David, who went on to be the Attorney General. So he doesn't get the top job in the Dáil Courts Winding Up Commission, which he's upset about. But he was offered a job which he didn't take. But he demanded payment for life as a judge of the Dáil, as a Supreme Justice of the Dáil, and he kept up the petition until 1934 to be paid a salary for life as Supreme Justice of the Dáil Courts. Now, they didn't give him that, but they did give him a pension in 1925 of £500 a year, which is a very substantial amount at the time, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like much today, but it's a lot. It's a lot at the time. Like, my grandparents, in and around that time, I believe, bought their house in Clarecastle, County Clare for €400. So he's getting €500.
Yeah.
Pounds.
Yeah.
I said euro. £500 a year. It's quite a lot. So he's doing fine, and he has a big house in the North Circular Road. He kept demanding his full salary as Supreme Justice of the Dáil Courts until 1934, when the High Court ruled against him on the grounds that he had taken the pension, so that it invalidated the other claim. But he became a staunch supporter of Sinn Féin, even post the split between Sinn Féin and Fianna Fáil. He criticised De Valera for taking the oath and entering the Dáil. He said it went back into the empire. was single his whole life and lived in a big house on the North Circular Road, but died in 1947, leaving an estate of £7,928. So, it's hard to see him as a victim of the Civil War, at the same time.
Well, do you know, did he practice as a solicitor or barrister in the state afterwards?
No, he left off his pension, I believe.
Oh, right, okay.
But, he would have been comfortably off.
Well, yeah, and I suppose that would have opened him up to accusations of hypocrisy if he was willing to work within the new state's legal system.
Well, exactly, yeah.
So it is an interesting thing to talk about, that you encourage people as part of this revolutionary movement to turn their backs on the legal system, the civil service, the government departments, and then at what point, which seems to be like the story of the Civil War and the treaty, at what point do you say the revolution has gone far enough, we'll revert to the past?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, and this is one of the things you can take from the story of the Dáil Courts is, this terrible disillusion of the Civil War, and this backtracking, and in the case of people like O'Higgins and Patrick Hogan, for example, close ally of Kevin O'Higgins, but also a man who had served as a judge of the Dáil Courts and who had been imprisoned as a result. This kind of slandering almost of the achievements, of the nationalist revolution, saying that it was all corrupt and incompetent and stuff, and you had to go back to the good old-fashioned system. That's part of the story as well, and it's beyond the terrible violence and stuff and the bitterness that caused. I mean, there is also a wider canvas, where the Civil War period is about backtracking on what you had done and almost saying it was wrong and you were stupid and should never have done it. So then that leads to some of these really bitter kind of divisions, I think, that we see in independent Ireland as well.
It is curious, isn't it? It's almost like invalidating the previous struggle.
Yeah.
Now, at the start, you talked about the fact that this was a very conservative body, the Dáil Courts.
Fairly conservative, yeah.
Fairly conservative in terms of the social movements that were happening at the time, the land and labour pressures coming from below. But did you find that there were many ordinary people who found that the system of justice in the Dáil Courts was better or more egalitarian than the British system at play at that time in Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the Dáil Courts were very much improvised. They started off as things to kind of settle land disputes, and they became arbitration courts, and then they became, the Dáil Courts. So it's not quite true that people were making them up as they went along, but they kind of were, So I mean, they probably varied a lot in their judgments. There does seem to be a lot of kind of cases where the judges tried to be more egalitarian. Like I talked about this example from Dublin where they tried to forgive someone's debt to a moneylender and so on. I think that, yes, there's an element of that, but I also think that, they were quite well appointed, right? The fact that there was 5,000 backed up cases, that loads of people who had no dog in the fight over the treaty, who weren't interested in that aspect of it, appealed that their cases be heard, that they had lodged cases and they wanted them heard, shows that the Dáil Courts were working, quite well in 1922. Or people seem to have had quite a lot of confidence in them.
Well, one thing we should mention as well is that probably a lot of people would be aware of the Dáil Courts through the movie The Wind That Shakes the Barley and Ken Loach's film from a couple of years ago, that they have quite an extended scene.
That's right.
In the Dáil Courts, and perhaps showing some of the hypocrisy regarding justice in some of the Dáil Courts. Yeah, and I mean, it's a good, like a lot of things in that movie. I mean, it's a good scene. It's a good introduction for people, and it tells them that the events of that time weren't just about ambushes and shooting and killing and so on. I mean, that there was a civil side to it, and there was a constructive side to it. One thing I will say though is that, like, in that scene in that movie, it's like I think there's it's a case of debt, I think, in the scene, and one person wants to forgive the debt, and the other one, doesn't want to because the person who they owe money to is influential and stuff like that. I don't think it was as informal as that, actually, because they did have, once they were set up, especially after the truce, they did have written procedure, and they did have circuit judges who were supervising them. So, I mean, first of all, I mean, in the Wind That Shakes the Barley, if I'm not mistaken, I mean, that happens at the height of the Time War, which wasn't possible. I mean, but during the truce, they were fairly regularly run, and they did have written codes of conduct and so on, and they did have supervision. So I don't think it was as informal as that. I think the people did expect some sort of
rule-based or law-based judgment from it. So just maybe to finish up though, I mean, I think this is kind of understudied aspect of the Irish Revolution, especially the dissolution of the Dáil Courts, which I think is a fascinating story. Just a quick thing about people who've done work on it. So Mary Katsounis, who was herself a judge, has written a book on this in the early 90s. John Borgonovo more recently wrote an article in a book called Justice, I think, in Conflict Societies. I think there's a lot more work to be done. And as I said, the records of the Dáil Courts Winding Up Commission, which have a lot of the records of the Dáil Courts, are held in the National Archives. So I think that's potential for further work for people.
Potential for an enterprising PhD student could find some good stuff there. One of the things that you mentioned earlier, John, was about the IRA acting outside of the Dáil Courts when somebody was accused of being an informer.
Yeah.
That this accusation wasn't something that they could be tried amongst before a body of judges in the locality. But given it such a serious accusation,
yeah,
and that, as we've seen, people are wrongly shot or wrongly accused of being informers.
Yeah,
it does call into question the whole legal ideas of the revolution.
Yeah, I mean, there were people with a very strong sense of legality. I mean, they really liked this idea of the law and stuff. And, you know, like when it comes down to the arguments about the treaty, a lot of them get very bogged down in these technical details about which is legal and which isn't. So in terms of informers, you know, in theory what happens was that, you know, there were military court-martials. So again, it's mimicking the British system in a lot of ways, right? That they was being tried by the military, which was the IRA, with crimes against the army, which was at war, the army of the Republic. That's the legal theory. Now, sometimes that does happen. Sometimes there is a court-martial body, which is, you know, a local IRA officers, and they do write to GHQ and they present evidence, and GHQ gives them permission. But a lot of the time, especially in County Cork, that did not happen. You know, the intelligence arm of the IRA figured that people were guilty of informing or other crimes, and, you know, they might have been taken in and questioned, but then they would have been shot without further ado. And I mean, there's complaints from GHQ, from Collins and Mulcahy, particularly Mulcahy, about how many people they're shooting in Cork. That isn't the same in every area, but yeah, there's I mean, it is, you know, it's a little bit like the collision between the theory and the reality, though. So in theory, they have this parallel legal system, and that includes this military dimension, the court-martial system. Reality is not like that, really. You know, especially in places like Cork, where there's a lot of people shot as informers. There's places where, you know, this isn't uniform. I mean, so I think there's 60 odd people shot as informers in County Cork, out of about 200 nationwide, you know. So, you know, some places shoot a lot, some places hardly shoot any, you know, like County Clare shoots about 3, I think. But yeah, I mean, I think the legality of the shooting of informers is a bit of a fiction.
Well, thank you very much for that, John. You're probably going to, I think, write up this for the Irish Story website, so people can find that on theirishstory.com. So thank you very much. That was John Dorney. My name is Cathal Brennan. If you'd like to listen to this or previous episodes of the show, please go to irishhistoryshow.ie. You can also check us out on Twitter at irishhistorypod or Facebook, our Facebook page. So until next time, thank you very much.